see not just extraordinary times, but an extraordinary belief that we can overcome these times and together reshape our future. When you step back, you'll see it's time for a different kind of expertise, one that helps sustain businesses, that can revitalize our economy. Because sometimes you need to step back to step into a more sustainable world. Partner with the bank that puts sustainability at its heart.
Friends from the mining and energy sectors, good afternoon. On behalf of my colleagues from the Nedbank mining teams, Nawaz Singh, Greg Weber, and myself, Amit Singh, Nedbank Energy Finance, we would like to welcome you all to this important engagement on the topic of unlocking renewable energy for the South African mining sector. The current national energy supply constraints in South Africa and the need for mining companies to secure reliable power and to deliver on their commitments to a cleaner future in terms of the Paris Climate Treaty, the efforts in securing clean renewable energy in our mining sector has intensified. The mining sector is one of the large consumers of power in South Africa. Therefore, these initiatives to transition to cleaner power will make a big impact in South Africa's commit to climate change. The ever-increased cost of electricity in South Africa and the constant decrease in the cost of renewable energy and battery storage has provided a further catalyst for mining companies to seek alternative clean energy. This journey has now begun. The last few years, we have seen significant activity and talk within the mining sector about implementing renewable energy projects. However, there's been significant barriers, be it either the regulatory framework, the licensing process, or the perceived risk of Eskom losing good-paying customers. These projects have not taken off. We think many of these barriers have now gone, and the mining sector will lead the renewable energy revolution in the South African embedded or captive sector. We're happy to have reached this point in the transition in the mining sector. Therefore, it is very appropriate that we be part of the Mining Indaba Week, where we host such a seminar to share our thoughts and industry specialists and experts to enlighten us on how the sector is moving and what are the barriers and how it's moved on. My co-host for this afternoon will be Mitch Brandt, who is also a senior member of the Energy Finance team at Nedbank. Please note that there will be a wonderful question and answer session in the end, but we would like you to post your questions and answers in the Q&A tab. Today, we will then start the engagement with Rob Futter, who is the Executive Director of Cresco Group. Rob is our first speaker. Rob has extensive knowledge and experience in the mining and infrastructure and energy sectors and has led numerous transactions, both in the mining and energy sectors. Cresco is also currently mandated by numerous mining houses to advise them to deliver these projects either on an IPP basis or on a corporate balance sheet basis. Therefore, we are very happy to have Rob with us, who will start the engagements and share his thoughts on how this sector is evolving. We'd like to thank you once again for giving us your time this afternoon on this important topic, and we are confident that we will all be much more knowledgeable after this session. Thank you, and over to Rob.
So good morning all. My name is Robert Futter. I'm a director at Cresco Project Finance. Thank you, Nedbank, for inviting us to this discussion. And we'll be focusing on captive power considerations, specifically focused on South Africa, and taking some of the experiences and lessons learned that Cresco's recently seen, based on us working largely for the buyers of power in this exciting and increasingly popular part of the economy. So just a snapshot of what Cresco's been doing, and to give you a little context around where we've been and what we've seen. So I think over the last 4 years, we've reviewed, adjudicated probably over 200, 250 bids. I'll accept mostly PV with an increasing amount of wind. But in addition to that, we've also done a fair bit of work in the cogeneration space, as well as coal-fired power stations. And you can see some of the names on the list there. And I'm sure you're very aware of some of the procurement programs that are currently out there. Sasol launching their wheeling program, Richards Bay Minerals expecting some bids next week, Anglo American Platinum, where we received bids end of last year and they're being adjudicated. But more and more we see large users looking at offsetting quite material percentages of their demand with renewable energy, either on-site or increasingly through wheeling. And I think the interesting bit around wheeling is the fact that it allows you to access wind energy, which is not always possible at the sites themselves or behind the meter. And with the time of use and the higher load factors of wind, we see that most clients are looking for a combination of an on-site solution as well as a wheeled solution. So generally, we see clients start this journey, and for many clients, this is a journey that they're not used to before. They're used to sort of buying yellow equipment on a 3-year type leased basis, or even just buying things straight out when commodity prices are high and there's lots of money around. But what increasingly we've seen is that we need to help clients through this process. And this sort of allows a stepped approach, and running out there and having an RFP is not always the first step. So more and more we are taking this approach with clients, and it might not be best practice on that, but it's definitely what seems to work and get us the best results in terms of being a competitive tariff at the lowest cost with the least risk to both the buyer and a fair risk allocation with the IPP. So firstly, we think it's important to define the energy strategy. And yes, we know renewables makes money from day one, or is savings relative to Eskom, but there needs to be a clear strategy in terms of what is the plan today, what is the plan over time. Most corporates have large carbon plans, 15%, 30% by 2030. But I think what we try to do with the client is take that high level objective and turn it into something that can work over time. We also do a whole lot of analysis for the client around long-term tariff, cost certainties and that, and from that we define a strategy, a phase 1, 2 and 3. Then for the specific site, and I've used notional dates here from one of the real projects we're working on, we would spend some time looking at the minimum energy requirements. So either consider if there is curtailment requirements, EIA fatal flaws, primarily for on-site. Wheeling should not be a concern because of existing permits. And then we take the client through what would the actual offset be, what should be the percentages. And I think what clients are very surprised about is that even though the capacities in numbers look very big, the actual amount of offset or energy is actually quite low because of the low load factors for PV and increasingly from wind. Then we sit with the client and we go through what's the preferred procurement approach, either IPP or EPC. Sometimes clients want to try and do both in the RFP process, or more importantly, what is the risk allocation that's planned between the parties. We've seen a number of procurement programs previously where the PPA is not there or there's no risk allocation clearly defined. And in that case, it's very difficult to confirm what is the quality of the tariff. And one thing we know is IPPs are very good at selling. They all like to put their best foot forward to get themselves in the game. And in many cases, that best foot forward isn't actually the final tariff that ends up when we get to adjudication or even financial close. And I think the last point on the slide is for buyers, it's very hard to understand that they actually need to put up credit support, guarantees, this whole idea of sellers default and you pay back debt potentially to get the lowest tariff is something that most buyers are not happy with or have never really considered. So we find that this risk allocation approach takes a long time. Then we go out and prepare a comprehensive request for proposal. And for us, this is all about assessing the market appetite and making sure that the submissions are very detailed. As I said, a tariff can only be adjudicated if we have a lot of supporting information that can make sure that the numbers that are coming from the client are fair. We talk a lot about the generation. They submit financial models, same as REAP. We ask them to do cash flow waterfalls. And then we also have a number of technical considerations. And more we're asking them to provide a power purchase agreement that either is the buyer's approach to how the allocation of risk should be, or we ask them to amend the power purchase agreement for what they believe would be the fairer risk allocation. And that then allows us to compare either the client's view of what the tariff should be or a improved tariff, but with a more risk allocation, more aligned with what the IPP is looking at. The RFP process goes out. We prefer to try and give the IPPs 3 to 4 months. That's not always possible because these COD dates set by the buyers are often unrealistic, all due respect. And then we try and do the adjudication as quickly as possible and preferred bidder. And we, as much as possible, try and do a like-for-like energy comparison. In some cases, we've done a best and final offer approach where we get 2 people who are very close, or maybe there's some small negotiation around PPA points that we'd like them to reconsider. But for us, the biggest thing that is important in this adjudication is proof of funding. And I think that's why Nedbank and being involved in this discussion today is there, because ultimately 70% of the money does come from a funder. And we need to be comfortable that the tariff that is submitted is supported by both an equity term sheet as well as a debt term sheet. And that debt term sheet is as much as possible as being firm. Now, we accept in many cases it cannot be completely credit approved, like perhaps some of the REIT rounds, but we want to know from the banks if there are any conditions precedent or key terms in the PPA that are not acceptable, they need to tell us now. We've had some examples on previous RFPs where the preferred bidder offer looked very good, and only when we engaged with the funder post that did we find out that actually the funding terms that supported that bid wasn't quite what the bank had agreed on because they viewed that there would be a different risk allocation. And for us, that is a key area of concern and where we want to spend more time with the buyer to make sure that their tariffs are fair. Then obviously we get the preferred bidder, assuming we have a very good PPA in place and it doesn't take a huge amount of negotiation. The generating license discussion is always one that takes a long time, and I know the NERSA person on the call will be spending more time with that. But then largely we push towards financial close and construction starts. So I think what most people don't quite accept is I think the world has become a different place from the beginning of 2020. And there's increasingly competition for IPPs. And very much it was a buyer's market beginning of last year, whereas now it's very much, in our view, a seller's market. And that's why RFPs that are set out need to be realistic. They need to be a fair risk allocation. And what we found is the better offers or the more credible IPPs are bidding into the projects where the systems, it's not an open tender. The system is not complex. The RFP process is not that complex, albeit that it is quite a complex procurement process in itself. And also the credit support is strong. You can see the list here of private buyers who are out there. I think we're aware of probably over 1,500 megawatts of projects that are in various stages of procurement from the private sector. We've obviously had medium-term risk mitigation that was come through. I know we had 28 bidders, not the 60. They were in square brackets. Round 5 is due to come. And then I think the munis at the bottom of the slide here with 3 munis going out on procurements, both historically and planning new ones, I think is creating a lot of competition. But more and more what we're finding is to get credible IPPs, you need to make sure that your buyer puts its best foot forward and makes it appetizing for an IPP to put its best foot forward and allocate resource to the right bidding process. So I think what we've seen is that there's been a significant difference between the way we're trying to engage with buyers on the generation profile. Now, historically under REAP, it's been a capacity factor type discussion, but more and more we see private buyers saying we need certainty on savings. And certainty of savings is very much driven by 3 factors. One is generation, one is the Eskom price increases, and one is obviously potentially change in the Megaflex tariff. Now, Eskom price increases and Megaflex tariff changes are largely within the remit of the buyer and are very difficult for an IPP to take the risk. But generation is very much something that we believe the IPP should be taking the risk on. And as you can see opposite here, this is a typical PV profile. And here you can see that actually there's not that much generation sitting in peak times when the buyer makes its biggest savings. Most of it's during the day. So what we have come up with and spending a lot of time with the buyers on is around the idea of guaranteed minimum megawatt hours. And yes, we cannot guarantee 93 kilowatt hours in January at 6 o'clock in the morning on this date. But what we are asking IPPs to is give us a consistent approach and try and do a over the year annual offset, which then we can do some sort of reconciliation on. Now, in the adjudication process, it's not about the lowest tariff, it's actually about the lowest savings versus Eskom. And on the right here is an example of a wheeling calculation from the Eskom spreadsheet for a Megaflex client using an example wind and PV projects that Cresco has on its database. And over here, you can see that we're getting an 83 cents in 2020 terms. So as long as the IPP tariff is below 83 cents, there should be savings for the client. Now, we are very much using this NPV of savings approach to do the calculation, assess the savings in today's money, and then we escalate the tariff based on the buyer's long-term view, and then run a number of scenarios around changes in the Megaflex tariff. Now, Eskom has already stated their case that the Megaflex tariff, not just the number, but the makeup of the tariff will change over time. So that includes, one is time of use hours changing, and we know that the morning peak will move to the evening if NERSA approves it. We also know that a large portion of the energy component is actually to become fixed as opposed to variable. So in very much we're saying to buyers, try and make your NPV of savings earlier in the process, knowing that yes, Eskom prices will increase, but the overall savings perhaps might decrease over time. And that is very much how the PPAs are structured. This is just a high-level comparison, and you could probably argue with some of the tariffs here. These are conservative tariffs, but comparing against a Megaflex client versus the IPP tariff here for on-site PV and sort of a wheeled wind project. So this IPP tariff also includes the generator's use of systems charges. And you can see here that PV and wind both give savings, at least in today's money, versus the load itself. But what we could definitely see is the combination of both provides quite a compelling case to use for both wind and PV for the buyer. One is because wind obviously have higher load factors, but then in addition to that, combining PV, and that does give significant benefits. And you can see there using our 50 megawatt example, 30% from PV, 70% from wind largely on terms of kilowatt hours, we're getting about a 9% savings versus the overall Eskom bill. And this is for us as a really reasonable phase one project. And this is about 110, 120 megawatts, depending on your generation profile. So we're trying to say to clients as much as possible, let's not go too big. Obviously, we need to try and also achieve some economies of scale, so it makes it interesting for the IPP. And they can at least get the benefits from their existing sites for wheeling. What we've also seen is that buyers are also trying to achieve other socioeconomic objectives. And that ranges from either mining charter compliance or potentially meeting socioeconomic requirements and other bits and pieces. And different clients are either following the government procurement or having to create their own. So we spend a lot of time with the clients saying, are we looking at sort of the option 1, 2, or 3 using my simplistic slide? Option 1 probably being the lowest tariff on the one side. Option 3 being more of a socioeconomic with a higher tariff, but trying to achieve different benefits. And we spend a lot of time with our clients saying, is it 25% BE? Is it 51? I know that NERSA are working on some rules of engagement to decide on the different generating license applications and how they will adjudicate, besides obviously the normal submissions. So for us, this is an important part of the procurement process. More and more, we've seen that IPPs are willing to accept 51% BE, and there is a slight tariff impact, but it's not materially changing the NPV of savings over time. So we're very much spending time saying to clients, let's look at option 2. You can get your mining charter benefits as well as achieve BE, and it reduces your risk around potentially the generating license. But I think everyone has an opinion, and I'd be interested in the other panelists' view on this point. This is the point earlier about the mining charter. So I think most of the large clients we deal with are under the mining charter, although other beneficiation also is included. And then the question is, what we've seen is that generally the interpretation of mining charter 3 varies across the clients. And therefore there are different requirements from a certain client based on what they believe, additional youth or women, or potentially under the content side. So I think most of the projects we see do require an element of mining charter compliance, but I do accept that it is quite difficult for the IPP to understand exactly what is needed from each RFP process. And we spend quite a bit of time with looking at the different clarifications to try and make sure that the bid, because this is generally a minimum compliance requirement, meets all our requirements, and there's not too many concerns where we get a good bid, but it doesn't quite meet this from a mining charter compliance point of view. So in summary, thank you for taking the time to listen to myself talk about captive power. We are very excited by recent changes in the regulations last year around the IRP, Goldfields' generation license application, which we hope to see as a positive outcome, the Amazon wheeling announcement. But more and more we see this as an increasing area of focus, and we believe it's a real opportunity for SA Inc. to put more megawatts on the grid without actually having to use the South African country balance sheet, which is always at risk, and in my view should be used for other more beneficial projects. Thank you very much for your time. Robert Vatter.
Thank you very much, Robert, for a very informative presentation. Robert has given us an interesting overview on the state of the mining sector's growing captive power market in South Africa. And through his presentation, it is clear that the jury is still out on where and how the biggest savings will be realized to make this a lucrative business proposition for the mining sector. And I'm sure there's a number of questions from our participants. I would also like to remind everyone that you are more than welcome to post some questions, and at the end of all our panelists, we will post some questions to them to answer. So without further delay, I just would like to introduce you to our next speaker, Ashen Yohu. Ashen is a leader of the Fasken Finance and Projects team in Johannesburg with extensive experience in project development, project and infrastructure finance and corporate finance, both locally and cross-border. He also advises lenders on sponsors and public-private partnerships. He advises on all aspects of limited recourse financing and has expertise in engineering, procurement and construction. In this area, he has advised engineering, procurement and construction management, operation and maintenance agreements, technical service agreements, power purchase agreements, and related legal services for project finance transactions. Ashen is recognized for his expertise in the field of projects and energy by Chambers Global. Additionally, he has been recognized by the International Law Office Client Choice Awards in the category for energy and natural resources. And I must say, we're really looking forward to your presentation. Over to you, Ashen.
Good afternoon. I'll be doing a short presentation on the legal structure of renewable energy projects in the mining sector, and we'll discuss some of the key bankability considerations that we have come across. There are various sources of power available to a mining company and an even greater number of ways to structure these. Therefore, it is important to contextualize the structure and the type of projects which are typically used. These projects are considered to be private sector projects. There's usually no utility involvement in the generation or sale of the power to the mining company, although utility may be involved in wheeling the power. The reasons that a mining company will look beyond the scope of purchasing power from a utility include the increases in or the high cost of power, the instability or the unavailability of the supply of power, or the lack of appropriate or cost-effective grid access. Project financing structures are typically used. The development of a power project is likely to require significant capital investment, and the implementation of a project finance structure will allow the mining company to procure the power on an off-balance sheet basis. The creation of a project-specific and separate company ensures the insolvency remoteness of this entity and can result in longer loan tenors and therefore lower tariffs. Using independent power producers then results in the mining company having little or no risk in the development of the project. In this structure, the mining company as the off-taker will enter into a power purchase agreement and grant related rights in relation to the building, ownership and operation of the power project to a single-purpose vehicle. The project company will be created and owned by an energy developer who would have been awarded the project either as a result of an unsolicited bid or competitive process undertaken by the mining company. Here's a simplified description of a typical IBP project finance structure. A sound project structure will limit interferences with the project, and this is key to the success of the project. As mentioned, the project company will be a new, legally distinct, ring-fenced entity established and capitalized by a developer. A substantial equity ownership provides a strong incentive to keep the project developer actively involved in the project and ultimately committed to the project's viability. The project company will enter into a power purchase agreement with the mining company in its capacity as the off-taker, and will often contract with third parties to perform certain of its other obligations, such as the construction, as well as the operation and maintenance. In addition to the equity capitalization, the project company will be funded with loans provided by lenders, such as commercial banks and development finance institutions, who typically lend the majority of the funding required on a limited recourse basis. The project company will be responsible for obtaining the relevant licenses and approvals. I will not be talking through the energy licensing process, as those will be discussed by Dennis Imela from NERSA later on. There's substantial benefits to a structure of this nature. However, they do incur more upfront costs due to the multiple parties, financing agreements, and other legal documents, as well as the extensive due diligence that will be required. It should be noted that these projects are complex and often require more time and a significant coordination from the parties involved. The PPA risk allocation. A bankable PPA is key for the success of the project, and this will be required by the lenders in order to provide project finance funding. The overarching principle in relation to risk apportionment in project finance transaction is that the various risks must be allocated to those who are best placed, willing, and able to assume them. These are some of the key risks that need to be identified and addressed. A fixed revenue stream. The mining company, as the off-taker, will be obliged to take and pay for all power produced by the mining company, irrespective of whether this power is consumed or required by the off-taker. Force majeure events or circumstances which are beyond the control of a party, such as acts of God, and these affect one or more of the parties' performance under the PPA. There is no one-size-fits-all, and the force majeure regime will ultimately take into account the timing of when the force majeure event occurs, the duration of it, and the consequences thereof, including the triggers for termination. Change in law. The project company will seek to be protected from future changes in law after the signature date. The off-taker usually assumes this risk and will undertake to keep the project company in the same economic position it would have been in but for the change in law. Compensation on termination is a key point for the project company's lenders and will regulate the amount which is payable by the off-taker in the event of termination. This could also be linked to options where the off-taker is either obliged to or entitled to purchase the project upon the happening of certain default or termination events. And finally, the assignment and change of control provisions. These are quite sensitive and are extensively negotiated. Ultimately, the requirement to have flexibility regarding the ability to sell the mining asset needs to be balanced against the project companies and the lender's requirement to always have a credible off-taker. And some of the other bankable considerations to be taken into account include the credit strength of the off-taker. Although the revenue stream is contractually agreed under the PPA, there still exists the risk that the off-taker does not meet its ongoing obligations under the PPA. The credit strength of the off-taker is a significant bankability concern, and an operating mining company which is highly geared may pose a bankability risk. In these circumstances, the project company and its lenders are likely to require a parent company guarantee for the off-taker's payment obligations under the PPA. The life of mine. Given the large capital costs of a power project and the significant sums borrowed, it may take time for a project company to generate sufficient revenue to pay back the loan. Therefore, it's likely to be a longer loan tenor with repayments ranging typically from 10 to 15 years. The PPA will need to be a few years longer than the debt term, and consequently, the life of mine must extend beyond the term of the PPA. Termination rights. The lenders are ultimately banking the revenue under the PPA and will want to ensure that there are no hair trigger events. In addition, the lenders will usually require the off-taker to enter into a direct agreement with the lenders, and this will provide the lenders with an opportunity to remedy defaults by the project company in order to prevent termination of the PPA. And finally, the lenders to the project company will take security over all of the assets of the project company, This will include registering notarial bonds over the power plant, as well as a cession of the PPA, project revenues, and any payment security provided, including parent company guarantees. It should be noted that any acquisition or proposed acquisition of the power plant by the off-taker will always be subject to this security being released firstly. These are just some of the key and more contentious risks which need to be considered and addressed in the structuring and development of these projects. As indicated, these structures are significantly beneficial to the parties involved. However, it's crucial that they are carefully structured and the risks are properly allocated and mitigated from inception. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashen, for a great presentation and also with a focus on bankability for projects in the mining sector. You have illustrated the benefits of procuring these projects through an IPP with project finance, and in light of the complexity of these projects, it is advisable to correctly structure these projects and carefully allocate the risks from the beginning on, and not to wait until the last to be making sure that your project finance has been properly structured. Without further delay, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Tereshini Charti. Tereshini has 12 years of experience in investment banking, of which the last 9 years have been spent originating, structuring, and executing project finance debt facilities for a number of local and continental African clients in the energy sector. In particular, she has in-depth experience with renewable energy projects in Africa. Tereshini began her career in Nedbank, and before her role in energy finance, she held roles in the deal management team within Nedbank. Over to you, Tereshini.
So good day, everybody. Today I will be talking about the funding considerations for mining power. As we see the move towards more renewable energy and the role of IPPs becoming more important in the sector, the role of debt is also becoming quite significant. So I will touch on debt funding and bankability issues, as well as the key role of BE equity funding and the availability of the funding. I will start by looking at the financing structures available, which includes the typical corporate finance balance sheet lending model and the project finance non-recourse lending model. Some firms that are cash flush may deem this option attractive. However, the biggest drawback is that the mining entity will not possess the skills and expertise required to build and operate the plants, which may lead to additional costs, time delays, and unstable power production. This then makes the alternative model more attractive, which is the limited recourse project finance structure. The IPP is able to manage the construction and operations of the project to ensure that the project is delivered on time, within budget, and with the minimum downtime during operations. The mine's ability to provide guarantees and liquid support is key in this model. Depending on the creditworthiness of the mine, a parent company guarantee may be required from the holding company to support obligations under the PPA. Understandably, this puts some stress on the mine due to possible consolidation of the assets and liability into its balance sheet. And this could impact some covenants and affect the mine's ability to take on additional encumbrances. However, the guarantees enables the IPP to gain more comfort with the large capital spends, and the banks are able to provide more favorable credit terms and longer tenors, thereby lowering the tariff to be paid by the mine. Another important consideration is change in control in the mines. Since the project is banked with a specific shareholding group, and given the long debt tenors, the lenders do monitor who owns and controls the mines. So in 2019, we saw a significant shift in the requirement for renewable energy power projects in mines, with over 3,500 megawatts of projects being announced. This was almost 3 times as much as the previous year, and this trend is only expected to increase over the next few years. With falling capital costs and increasingly more proven technology coming on board, companies are opting for hybrid solutions that gear mines towards 80 to 100% renewable energy power. Last year, several mines announced hybrid solutions involving multiple technologies. The Sukari gold mine in Egypt is considering a solar battery hybrid solution that would cost $37 million US. We also saw the likes of Oz Minerals and USA Rare Earth announce plans to run some of their mines on 100% renewable energy. Additionally, a hybrid of multiple technologies are being proposed by many mines. BHP saw a 5-year plan to power the Queensland mine with a mix of solar, wind, hydro, and gas technologies. The attractiveness of hybrid technology is due to the baseload characteristics that the plant can provide, and it enables the mine to become less reliant on the grid, which is unstable and unreliable in South Africa. We recently went through a bidding process in the risk mitigation program, and it is clear that South Africa is also moving in this direction and away from diesel. These hybrid structures are complex, they involve multiple contractors and are difficult to manage, and the role of the IPP becomes key. I will discuss some of the key bankability factors from a lender's perspective. The longer tenors are essential for repayment of these large capital costs and also to lower the tariff. The off-taker's credit quality is essential to support the longer tenors. The life of mine must also be able to support the term, and if it is shorter than the PPA, could pose a bankability risk. Value of mine assessment is critical for revenue projection in the project. Nedbank's energy, finance, and mining teams work closely in this regard. A case could also be made for proving of additional resources, which, depending on debt structuring, could help with increasing tenors. There are some interesting structures to increase tenors, such as soft and hard mini-perms and rolling facilities, and the role of DFIs also becomes important to unlock these different structures. Looking at the PPA, we would expect to see some level of take-or-pay payment terms. That is, the off-taker is obligated to buy a portion of the power that is produced by the project. This ensures security of revenue. This would become more flexible if the IPP is able to enter into multiple PPA arrangements, with the overflow going either to other industrial companies or to the grid. Unfortunately, the South African market and the South African grid is not liberalized and advanced to accommodate this. Assets in South Africa are currently built for single use, and if the mine ceases operations, then it becomes a stranded asset. If multiple use becomes available in time, then lenders can take on more aggressive financing views. But as it stands, the credit support from the mine becomes a key bankability factor. Another important aspect for banks is the environmental risk. That is, and this is especially important for Nedbank, being a green and an equator principle bank. Renewable energy projects play well into this, as mines aim to lower their carbon footprint by switching to cleaner technologies. Renewable energy projects give mines least cost production, but more importantly, security of supply is established. The IPP model also brings a benefit of empowering the local communities. The Ring Fence project is able to procure equipment and skills locally, employ local people in the surrounding communities, and uplift the communities through social spend. The skills transfer from international contractors is also quite valuable here. There have been some challenges to note, though, from the bid processes completed to date. The bidding process can become complicated and drawn out. Timelines are often not fixed or complied with, and there are sometimes changes to key information late in the process. We would expect to see the process becoming more simplified in future, allowing for more competitive and informed bids. It should also be appreciated that there is a lot that is currently happening in the South African market with risk mitigation and REIP, and resources within the technical firms, the legal firms, and lending teams in the banks is limited. The long and complicated adjudicating process could result in resources not being available for these projects. Additionally, the Tier 1 IPPs could turn their focus to programs with known processes and defined timelines that are easier to transact on. With so much happening, it also begs the question of liquidity in the market to fund all these projects. The liquidity should be filled between the local banks, domestic and international DFIs, and the institutional funds who are increasingly becoming more interested in the sector. There is progress being made with project bonds. Nedbank has a team closely looking at this, and this will increase the depth in the market in time. Another difficulty is the difficulty in obtaining the generation license. An article in Engineering News recently cited that raising the distributed generation threshold to 50 megawatt could unlock 5,000 megawatts in 5 years. So we will hope to either see the threshold increasing or an improvement in the framework structure. The involvement of BEE entities in the equity structure is quite key in the South African context. However, BEE entities typically do not have large enough balance sheets to fund the equity participation. BEE funding from financial institutions becomes very important in developing these projects. Funding is issued by way of either term loan or preference share funding. The two general structures that are applicable are single asset lens or portfolio lens. Portfolio lens enables the BEE entity to pledge the dividend flows from multiple assets to secure funding and is the favored lending structure as it improves the credit terms. The principal finance team at Nedbank offers BEE equity funding solutions, and some of the key factors considered includes the ability of the client to fund off their own balance sheet. Similar to project finance model, BEE equity funding will not be excessively geared. This may sometimes pose a challenge as the balance sheets are not typically large. Funding terms range up to 7 years, with the borrower having to take a view on refinancing after year 7. Some clients may find difficulty with the shorter terms and accepting the refinancing risk. It is also important that clients get good tax advice to avoid any tax leakage. This is especially important with preference share funding. In general, though, the process is becoming more streamlined and it's becoming easier to structure BEE equity solutions in power transactions. So projects in the mining sector have been proven to be bankable. We see that there's continuous improvement, especially as we see more processes being run. With the different approaches to both project financing and to lending, we see that the sector is becoming unlocked. There are different ways to structure to overcome the bankability issues, and Nedbank has a dedicated energy finance team who works closely with our mining team to overcome these issues and assist with funding.
Thank you, Tereshini. I think you've given us a good taste on the issues of bankability and what banks look to fund these transactions. But more importantly, I think you bring up important topics of the availability of liquidity from commercial and international DFIs and local DFIs to put money into these projects. So there's no barriers in terms of funding. These projects can be structured into a bankable state, and it has been done, and the banks are willing to work with both the IPPs and the mines to transact these things. But I think the most important thing is the life of mine and the ability to have a mining team close to you, to the energy team, to fund these projects, to unpack and to address the risk of the mine this being a single offtake assets. So Nedbank has both these teams together, a leading mining team and leading energy finance team, and this partnership seems to be the one that will definitely lead the funding space in these renewable energy projects in the mining sector. The next speaker, I have the privilege to introduce Mr. Kun Langi from ANG, who is a senior hydrogen solutions developer of Energy Hydrogen. Kun is a master's degree holder of industrial engineering based in South America. He has led several energy projects and later switched in the traditional renewable side and later focused himself and his energy on electromobility, batteries, and hydrogen. He is currently working exclusively on the hydrogen solutions for NG Group, and where he is the new renewable hydrogen business unit head. And he is actively involved in the developments of hydrogen and has shared strong partnerships with many institutions. As we know, hydrogen is the new buzzword and also an important component in the mining sector, which can further help them reduce the carbon footprint and bring in value in terms of reduced operating costs. We're seeing a lot happening in the hydrogen space, and we're very honored to have Kun to present some of his thoughts on how the South African mining sector or the general mining sector can benefit from hydrogen. Over to you, Kun. Thank you.
Hello everyone, Koen Lengi here from ENGIE's Hydrogen Business Unit. And today I will be guiding you through which role hydrogen can play in fast-tracking South Africa's energy transition. Just before going into the details, a quick overview in numbers of what ENGIE is all about. I really want to focus on these values here. So you see ENGIE is a large utility company, but most importantly, we're pushing very actively for the decarbonization and making the energy transition, as you can see from these KPIs. Beyond this, so ENGIE is really working on decarbonization as a service, where really we try to take away this issue from our customers, which can be both public and private, and work together with them to come up with tailor-made solutions. And this is where, as you can see here, the biggest portion of our human capital is working on this currently. The idea is to have a fully integrated solution where we go all the way from the design, structuring it, also from financing, and then going to implementation, operate and maintain it. So really the full-fledged solution. Just to close, within Africa, we have several activities, specifically in South Africa. You can see here at the bottom, several activities in the renewables with the K2, CSP, but also PV and wind projects. And more importantly, it's not yet shown here, but we have a project under development with Anglo American in Mogalakwena around the hydrogen mining trucks, and I'll come back to that later. So for those of you who are not fully familiar with hydrogen, I'll just explain hydrogen in a nutshell. Very difficult because it's a broad topic, of course, but hydrogen, what is it? So the first element from the periodic table is hydrogen. It's not new. It's been used by NASA, for example, in their space travels. It has been discovered, as you can see, already a while back. Even the first hydrogen-powered vehicle is already from 1806, so it's not a new subject. Why is it so relevant for us? Really because it has a very high energy density. You can see almost 100 times more than the best lithium-ion battery. There is a challenge of storing it because it's a very light molecule, so it's 14 times lighter than air. So this is really the challenge that we have. But on the other hand, it allows us to transform energy at a very high efficiency rate from hydrogen back into electrical power, as you can see here, 40 to 60%. So certainly a good option to compete against a diesel combustion engine, for example. So the hydrogen market is also not new. It is an existing market mainly for refining of fossil fuels, but also basic chemicals such as methanol, ammonia. And as you can see, the fuel cell market is only a very small portion today, but this is really the market that is going to grow a lot in the coming years, and it will grow the market potential of this sector. Unfortunately, today hydrogen production is mainly done by fossil fuels. You can see it here, mainly natural gas, but also carbon. And this is really where you see this portion here, water electrolysis. Only 0.4%. This is constantly growing, but this is what we really want to push as ENGIE and what really could have a good impact in South Africa as well. So what is the hydrogen market for tomorrow? This is where hydrogen can be produced with renewable energies. At one side, we can use the grid to have some stability. We will use electrolysis to break down water into hydrogen and oxygen. This hydrogen, it can be stored, it can be used to make natural gas by combining with CO2, it can be used to make chemicals such as ammonia, it can even be used to make synthetic fuels. We can make synthetic diesel, methanol, or whatever is needed, or we can inject it within the gas grid and blend it with natural gas. Beyond this, we can use it directly, which is of course the best way. And using it directly could be for mobility, road transport, mining mobility. I'll come back to this. But it could also be used to combust or in a fuel cell to generate electric power for the grid. Or we can use it to combust it for heat applications, for high temperature processing of minerals, for example. Really, this is the reason why we call it an energy vector. because hydrogen allows us to connect all these different segments, which in a way are separate today. You have the electrical grid at one side and you have the whole fossil fuel world at the other. This, with hydrogen, we can connect it, which will provide a lot of stability to our renewable electricity generation and to the grid as a whole. Very briefly on the technologies. So electrolysis is the process where we will break down the water molecule by applying an electrical current into oxygen and hydrogen. There is several technologies. The one that you see depicted here, this is an alkaline electrolyzer, but there is also the PEM, which is the one that is using platinum, which is of key interest for South Africa as well. The fuel cell is very simply said the opposite process. We will combine hydrogen at one side with oxygen at the other. This will generate an electric current to flow from the anode to the cathode, and the hydrogen will pass through the membrane to combine with oxygen and to generate water vapor. And there is some heat generated, which we could use for certain applications as well. But remember, the efficiency of this unit is 40 to 60%, so very beneficial compared to combustion engines. Last part on the hydrogen, this is really the vision from ENGIE. We are focusing on countries where we have competitive renewables, and we're looking then at energy intensive sectors to kickstart the market locally. But eventually we want to have an export of hydrogen so that we can really export renewable energy from one country to another. And this is certainly where South Africa could be exporting to, let's say, Europe, Japan, to some of the countries that have a deficit of renewable energy if they really want to decarbonize the full energy matrix. And some projects, just to highlight, there is many projects around chemicals, HyEx, ammonia nitrate, urea, ammonia, and we have this project with Anglo around mining trucks. Many more projects in the pipeline that we cannot share yet, but you will see a lot of announcements coming this year as well. So having said that, around hydrogen, what is today the South African context around the energy transition? And I've used some information from the International Energy Agency just to give a broader context to this question. So you can see the different flows of, let's say, coal, oil being used and then eventually ending up in different segments. On this one, you can clearly see there's a big role to play for coal these days. You can even see for the electricity, this big portion of power loss from the coal, which is about 70% that is being lost. So really sad that so many CO2 emissions are generated for nothing in a way. If I then jump in the finer detail, where you can see the energy consumption per segment, we see that a big portion, almost 18%, is used related to mining and minerals, which is a key segment within South Africa. And an even bigger portion is used by road transport. This is 24%. So clearly these are two segments that it would be good to look at if we want to do something around the energy transition. Just as a side note, I looked up how are these sectors represented in the GDP that is being generated in South Africa. And if you look at mining and transport, it's 18% of the GDP, while it's about 42% of South Africa's final energy consumption. Even more interesting, I found that the electricity, which is actually electricity, gas and water, is only 4% of the GDP contribution, while actually, as indicated before, we are burning so much coal to generate this electricity that it's almost consuming 40% of South Africa's primary energy sources, while it only generates 4% of the GDP. So this brings us the question, is this really sustainable, right? To take the context to another area, this is where we're looking at renewable resources. What is the solar resources that South Africa has? So you can see here, it's one of the better areas in the world in relation of specific photovoltaic power output. So what is the energy that a solar panel would generate? Very comparable to the good areas in Chile and Australia. So nothing to worry about there. Even for the wind resources, very good opportunities as well. that could be captured. So how does this relate to green hydrogen? And again, this is where the IEA, they did a very interesting study around the future of hydrogen, and they mapped all these variables together and to give you a map of hydrogen prices in dollars per kilogram. And you can see the color coding here. So really for South Africa, you're very good positioned to get competitive green hydrogen thanks to these renewable resources that you have available. So how do we really start capturing this opportunity and making this energy transition that we're all waiting for? I will revert back to our vision on the market in a way. We need to focus on key segments. And clearly we have seen for South Africa that mobility, road transport is one key segment. And this is where hydrogen is really able to decarbonize the use of these applications. You can see in this graph here, which is from the Hydrogen Council, for small applications, batteries make sense, right? For your personal car, you don't use it as often, it's a small vehicle. Okay, let's do battery. But as soon as you start using a vehicle very often, like a taxi, or even bigger, like a mining truck, you will need a technology that can have a longer autonomy, and that also can be a lot quicker in recharging. And this is where hydrogen really starts making sense. And if we even want to take it further, if we want to decarbonize shipping, transport, or aviation, this is where hydrogen-based fuels, this would be synthetic fuels such as methanol, ammonia, or even synthetic kerosene, could be created based on green hydrogen to fully decarbonize these segments as well. Then we have the other segment that we saw was very intensive in South Africa, which is mining. And this is where we are actively developing new hydrogen solutions, as it says, to unlock the pathways to net zero mining for our customers. Of course, we will leverage on renewables to generate them. And once we have this hydrogen infrastructure in place, we clearly see a big role for hydrogen mobility. This is what the project with Anglo American is all about. But there's also a role of hydrogen combustion. Even hydrogen could be used for green explosives. We're doing a project in Chile where we're going to create ammonium nitrate, which is a building block for this. And furthermore, once you extract the minerals, we have to look at the full value chain of the minerals. So transporting them by train or by ship, also there's a clear role for hydrogen to decarbonize the fuel consumptions that occur here. So together with partners, ENGIE has already started. And this is where we have the project with Anglo American in Mogalakwena, where we will decarbonize. We will start with one hydrogen mining truck. If successful, the proof of concept, which we will know mid of this year, then we will actively start working together on scaling up for this mine. And hopefully we will look for other mines, both with Anglo American, but we are also actively developing with other mining customers in South Africa and abroad. Besides this, to push the road mobility part, which we have seen as an important segment as well, we are currently developing what we call a hydrogen valley. For those who have not yet seen any announcement around this, today there is not yet a hydrogen valley in Africa and in the whole continent. And it's a concept that is occurring in Europe, in the US. And these are really regions where transport could be decarbonized with hydrogen, but also other hydrogen applications could occur. And we try to bring together all these different opportunities to capture the synergies to make this happen. So this should be going as well in the right direction, and hopefully we can make some more announcement around this in the months to come. Just going back to the part where we need today 40% of the prime energy to generate electricity, which is part of the challenge. So we get this pressure to generate more renewables. But at the same time, by having more renewables, you get the problem that you have the grid stability, you need storage and so on. So in a way, if then we have more renewable hydrogen for different applications, I've indicated before, this will indirectly generate flexibility for the system. And it will allow us, one, of course, to reduce cost, both for the hydrogen technologies and for the renewables. But on the other side, it will allow us to integrate more renewables within the electrical system. And it will really create this virtuous circle, as we call it, allowing us to displace more and more coal, so that really the grid as well within South Africa can become more sustainable. So it's really key, and this is why it's key to have early adopters and, let's say, to get the ball rolling to make this happen. That's not it. So this is just the start. What we're doing today is just, as I like to call it, the tip of the iceberg. Really, the opportunity is much bigger than this. So if we look at it from a global perspective, and even if this is not up to date fully, you can see that the challenge that we have is huge. We need to transform all these fossil fuels into a green variant to make our decarbonization happening. How does this translate in hydrogen opportunities? This is an extract from the Hydrogen Council again. You can see that today the segment is mainly the existing segments, as I mentioned, refineries, chemicals. But you can see that there will be a very rapid growth going to 2050 of many new applications, where we will use hydrogen for transportation, as indicated, where we will use hydrogen even for power generation, for heat, and of course as feedstock for new elements such as ammonia, which could be used as a fuel, or methanol, which could be used as a fuel as well. Some other numbers that they gave us, and I like to pause here. So 30 million jobs to be created by 2050. So a big portion of these jobs could be captured by South Africa if we activate this market. And then there is annual sales, let's say, of hydrogen and equipment of $2.5 trillion. So this is a vast market that is going to be created. And by 2050, we will not even have captured the whole opportunity that you see here. So this is only something that will continue to grow. So some potential H2 markets, you have mining, as indicated. Some of the players, and this is just illustratives, and there's many more. You have a steel sector, you have ArcelorMittal, and you have iron ore extraction. Within steel, hydrogen can play a key role for its reduction. You have gas infrastructure with Transnet and probably many other players. You have mobility, again, some important companies such as South African Airways, again, Transnet for the trains, Imperial Logistics, Marks, and there's many more that could start working in this area. And you have the petrochemical sector and fertilizer, where clearly Sasol is a very important stakeholder to be looking at. So just as a very rough estimation, the potential worth of the local green hydrogen market in South Africa can easily surpass $10 billion. So it's certainly something we want to look at going further. If we then think about export, so you've probably seen big announcements from Chile, from Australia, that they want to do hydrogen exports to Europe or to some of the Asian countries such as Korea and Japan. Actually, South Africa is right in the middle, so it's strategically positioned from a geographical point of view. And as indicated before, it also has all the conditions to make green hydrogen at competitive prices. And it has some very interesting port infrastructures, such as the port in Saldanha and the port in Durban. So why not start thinking as well about exporting green hydrogen once the local demand is growing and scaling up? And again, here, very rough estimation, but this can easily surpass a $100 billion business of hydrogen export to other countries. So to achieve all this, it's key. You see many segments are involved, many stakeholders are involved. It's really key that we co-create this together so that we don't lose time, as we like to call it, in this ego void, and we reach very rapidly productivity and also, let's say, gain for all the stakeholders involved. And just as a last quote from Nelson Mandela, there's no passion to be found playing small. So I really invite you all to think big for South Africa and Africa as a continent and a whole to make this happen. Green hydrogen can really be the differentiating factor to really make this energy transition happen for South Africa and Africa as a whole. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Kun. I think we can listen to the role of hydrogen for many, many hours, and this is just a teaser for. what we expect the sector to do for us in the future. Thank you, Koen, again. We know that the hydrogen has a big role to play to reduce carbon, to bring a pathway to not net zero emissions, but I think the critical part there is the renewable energy associated with that in terms of the electrolysis project, and the more renewable power that we can get on grid, some of it can be used to generate hydrogen and store it for future use. But I think what's most interesting and caught my mind is the ability of the hydrogen economy to create jobs in South Africa, especially with our unemployment and the challenges we have in that space. We think this is quite an important thing, not only to export our minerals, but also the hydrogen produced in a country that's also blessed with such good solar and wind resources. So we hope that the mining sector and the industry is taking note of the ability to generate hydrogen and export it, and also use it in part of their domestic operations. Now I have the pleasure and honor to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Dennis Simela, who is the Acting Executive Manager of Energy Regulation and the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, NERSA. Dennis is no stranger to the South African sector. He has more than 24 years experience to technical, economic, regulation, and public and private sectors in the energy sector. He's an electrical engineer by trade, but the last few years he's been engaged with the regulation side of it. Dennis headed up many licensing activities in NERSA, and we are also known of the good work he has done as part of unlocking the licenses for the very successful South African REAP, or Renewable Energy Independent Power Procurement Program. So Dennis and NERSA, we thank you for all that good work, which has really started South Africa's renewable energy journey. Dennis, before he joined NERSA, he had very senior positions in various organizations. He spent more than 10 years with our electrical utility Eskom, and has spent more than a decade with NERSA. This demonstrates in-depth experience in the electrical supply industry. Would I like to ask Dennis to present to us on one of the most important points in unlocking the renewable energy sector for the South African mining space is the role of regulations, and how will NERSA go along and implement regulations or approve licenses. We did hear about one plant, one mine getting the license, and now we'd like to see how will this big important factor in the sector be achieved through NERSA's intervention. Thank you, and over to Dennis.
My name is Dennis Simela. I'm going to present on the topic enabling renewable energy to transition the mining sector. Who's NERSA? I just want to introduce the organization. NERSA is established in terms of the National Energy Regulator Act, Act number 40 of 2004. It is an independent regulator. I need to qualify this, that anything that we do is independent, but in terms of the projects that we have to do to make sure that we complete them, we report to the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy. NERSA consists of 4 full-time regulator members and 5 part-time regulator members. The way you can view it is that the 4 full-time regulator members is like executive directors, and then the 5 are part-time, or what you call non-executive directors in other organizations. NERSA is responsible for the regulation of 3 energy industries: electricity, pipe gas, and petroleum pipeline, but today's topic is more on the electricity side. The rest of the NERSA staff support the energy regulator, so we are like secretariat to the energy regulator. All the decisions that NERSA makes should be based on reasons, facts, and evidence. The legislative mandate. NERSA's mandate is anchored in 4 primary acts. It's the National Energy Regulator Act, as I mentioned initially, is the Electricity Regulation Act of 2006, Act number 4 of 2006. There are 2 additional acts, but they're not relevant today, the Gas Act and the Petroleum Pipeline Act. There are also 3 levies acts. That's where we get our monies or resources to be able to support NERSA. There's a Gas Regulator Levies Act, Petroleum Pipeline Levies Act. The last one, Section 5B of the Electricity Act of 1987, it does affect, more so the licensed generators because they have to pay a levy on an annual basis. There are facilitation legislation, there are lots of them, but I only chose 3, which I think these are the primary one. The PFME, which has got to do with the way we do our business. The Promotion of Access to Information Act. If you need any information that's confidential from NESA, you have to follow that act. The last one is very important. That's why I put it in red. When we undertake licensing or registration, we have to observe or we have to use this particular act or apply it. It's the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act of 2000, Act number 3 of 2000. It's normally abbreviated PAJA. I need to explain this regulatory cycle to you to say that, everywhere in the world, people use this very same cycle for regulation. In South Africa, the make is predominantly in the sphere of government. That means the government has to come with the acts, the policies, the regulation, the notices. As NESA, we are under the operate. That means we implement what the government has gazetted or promulgated. So this is in the sphere of NESA. The last one is the review. The review, I think people are aware that, we're already in court with ESCOM regarding, tariffs. Normally the review sits with the courts in South Africa. But if you look at the National Energy Regulator Act, it expects whoever is not happy with NESA's decision to again appeal to the very same organization, NESA. So somehow there's a void or a gap in terms of that. So the other alternative is to go to court. And then that's what happens most of the time. People who are not happy with NESA's decision, they go to court. I just need to expand on the mandate. In fact, I can put it in open and close inverted commas and say these are regulatory tools. In whatever that we do, we have to observe the law. The law in this particular instance is the Electricity Regulation Act of 2006. We sometimes call it the Bible in the Electricity Regulation Division. We use the regulations that are coming from the spheres of government. The electricity pricing policy is very relevant to us. The electricity regulation, specifically for this particular presentation, is regulation on new generation capacity. We've got the licensing exemption and registration notice, which relates to registration. We also have a directive, what we call a directive. I put it in open and closed inverted commas. We got it in the form of a letter. It's a ministerial letter offering a blanket approval from complying with the integrated resource plan. And I'll expand on this later on. I just want you to understand the role of the regulator. It's very similar in other jurisdictions as well. All regulators do fundamental, almost the same thing. Okay, we regulate tariffs and prices, we license, we set license conditions, we monitor compliance, we ensure compliance, we mediate or arbitrate in the event of disputes, we gather and store industry information. Today's topic is more on the licensing and the registration. And then, we use a framework. The frameworks differ from one jurisdiction to the other, but if you look at it fundamentally, they are similar in a way. The difference in different jurisdictions is the objectives. Okay, each country has got different objectives, in terms of regulating the supply industry. In the case of South Africa, the regulator must have objective to achieve the regulatory functions. In the case of South Africa, here are the objectives. The first objective, which is very important as well, in fact, all of them are important, is to achieve efficient, effective, sustainable, and orderly development of the electricity supply industry in South Africa. This is very relevant to licensing or registration. To safeguard and meet the interests and requirements of present and future electricity consumers and end users, to facilitate investment and universal access to electricity, to promote the use of diverse energy sources, energy efficiency, competitiveness, and customer choice, to facilitate a fair balance between the interests of customers, licensees, investors, and the public. Without going too much into the entire Electricity Regulation Act, I specifically chose, those sections of the Act that relates to registration, and then to see what criteria, what do you need to do if you need to register with NERSA. If you look at Section 7.1, it says that no person without a license issued by the regulator, in accordance with this Act, should operate any generation, any facility. You've got a generation, transmission, distribution, import, export, or trading facility, but the most relevant in today's meeting is more generation or to some extent trading. And then it says, notwithstanding what I've just said now, okay, and there is also a schedule in the Act that says that, if you actually qualify in that particular schedule, which is part of the Electricity Regulation Act, it's right at the end, there are conditions to say that you need not apply for or hold a license issued by the regulator. But I must emphasize that, the licensing exemption and registration notice has actually substituted the Schedule 2 that is there in the Electricity Regulation Act. Section 9 is also very important. The minister may, in consultation with the regulator, determine by notice, and the notice has been issued by the minister already. That's the one that I talked about, the licensing exemption and registration notion, that any person involved in activity relating to trading or generation, transmission, or distribution that does not require license in terms of 7 raised with Section 8 must register with the regulator. Remember that I said that you cannot operate any facility without a license. So if you can't get a license, you somehow have to register with the regulator. The criteria and facilitation of registration is a continuation of the previous slide. Okay, Section 9.2 says any person who has to register with the regulator must do so in the form and in accordance with the prescribed procedure, and an application for registration must be accompanied by the registration fee. I must say that, NERSA, we have already developed, a flow chart to assist, any potential applicants. We have, done the prescribed procedure. Once you have applied, we have made a commitment to say that we'll actually do the registration within 60 days. Since the Act says that, the application must be accompanied by a registration fee, we have already determined a registration fee, which is 200 Rand. And before we even determine this particular fee, we went through the public participation process to ensure that everybody is aware of it, and that they buy into the proposed or prescribed figure. Licensing, exemption, and registration notice. I just need to expand on this particular one. It applies to generation facilities with megawatts output of no more than 1 megawatt. I must emphasize this because the initial notice was talking about the capacity of 1 megawatt. Now it's no longer the capacity, it's the output capacity. That shouldn't be more than 1 megawatt. With a connection to the distribution system, because it's embedded in a distribution system, supplies electricity to customer or related customers with or without willing. The related customers is in terms of the Companies Act. I can give an example. All those companies, for instance, there should be a subsidiaries or there should be any other financial arrangements to show that the companies are related. But that particular arrangement should be recognized by the Companies Act. It includes all use generation or bilateral. By bilaterals, I mean generators selling to a customer or related customers. It includes facilities producing electricity from waste or residual products of underlying industrial processes. I know some people may say, how is this relevant to mining? That means you can get a generator to supply the mine, and then that particular generator could be producing electricity from the waste or residual products. And then the very same facility should be operated solely for consumption by a customer who's related to the generator or owner of the generation facility. Licensing and registration notice continued. I'm trying to unpack it further. It includes demonstration facilities connected or not connected to the transmission or distribution, but operated to no more than 36 months. By this, it's like we're trying to facilitate, creativity and innovations in the country. If you are able to come up with a new concept and you want to try that particular concept to see if it's going to work or not, you are allowed to register that particular project that's based on a new concept or new innovation, and then it has to be registered with the regulator for a period of 36 months. The registration excludes generation facilities for the sole purpose of standby or backup generation. Another way, if you have a backup or standby generation, which most of the mines do have standby generators, those ones are excluded from being registered. It excludes, off-grid, those facilities that are not connected to the network. And then it excludes any capacity, output capacity of more than 1 megawatt. By that, anything that's more than 1 megawatt, or the output, or any generator that the output is more than 1 megawatt, it has to be licensed with NERSA. Now, since for those generation facilities that are more than 1 megawatt, I must be specific, with the output capacity of more than 1 megawatt, those ones need to be licensed by NERSA or the energy regulator. And then the section of the Act where it applies, where you have to look at when you make an application to NERSA, you must look at section 4A, Roman figure 1, that the regulator must consider application for licenses and may issue licensing for the operation of all those facilities, but the ones that are more specific to the mines in relation to this particular presentation is generation and trading to some extent. Section 34(1) specifies that the Minister of Energy, in this particular instance, the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, may, in consultation with the regulator, determine what new generation capacity is needed, how it is to be produced, what types of generation are needed, who may buy it, and is going to be given wide powers to accomplish this. He's talking about the minister. However, to amplify this particular section, the minister has issued a regulation on new generation capacity. It has been recently amended to include municipalities or local government. Section 34(3) says that the regulator, in issuing the license, the regulator is bound by the determination from the minister. And then I need to unpack this in the next slide. Now, you can ask yourself a question. Does that mean is licensing only done in terms of determination? The answer is a big no. For all new generation, the minister has offered a blanket approval from complying with IRP. So we have received a letter. And then that particular letter, it actually allows, generator factors still need, it actually stipulates that, for any generators above 1 megawatt, to comply with this particular directive, you still need to apply for a license. And then the very same directive, it went further to explain the term own use facility or own use generation facility, that it must supply power to a single customer with or without wheeling. It's operated solely to supply to a single customer or related customers. The interesting thing regarding this particular directive is that there's no limit in terms of capacity. They didn't mention any limit. To us as NERSA, that any capacity above 1 megawatt is allowed, as long as you meet the requirement that is being specified in the directive. You also meet the license criteria as stipulated in the licensing procedure, in the NERSA licensing procedure. Now, what do you need to do for one to apply for a license? I need to expand this. You'll find it in section 10(2) of the Electricity Regulation Act. You will need the description of the applicant, including any relationships. Okay. By that, if that shareholding or other companies that they've already shares in that particular company, we need to know the structure and see all the shareholding leakages in that particular application. We need evidence of administrative, financial, and technical abilities. That's very important. It's what we do in terms of prudency and assessment as NESA. Description of the proposed facility to be constructed or operated. Description of type of customer or customers or related customers. Tariffs and price policies considered if you're selling to someone else in the form of a bilateral. Plans and ability to comply with all applicable legislation, including legislation, the environmental legislation, safety, which is not really in the realm of NESA, but you have to comply with them or provide evidence to show that you do comply with those ones. A detailed specification of the services that will be rendered by the generator. You should be able to show clearly what is it. Are you selling to this particular customer and what type of services are going to be provided by that particular generator? The next one is evidence of compliance with IRP or provide reasons for any deviation for approval by the minister. This is very important. That's the reason why I underline it. The directive or blanket letter that we receive from the minister basically says that you don't have to comply with this as long as it's own use and that own use qualify or it meets the requirements of the directive. What we have done as NESA, because that letter was sent to NESA as a confidential letter, we have taken the contents of the letter and put it in the media statement and released the statement to the public. All the facilities, in terms of licensing, they must comply with the grid code. That's very important, or the South African grid code. Now, in terms of pricing, it relates not for own use, because if a mining company decides to have a generation facility using their own bottom line, or they go and borrow money from any financial institution to put up that particular generator, and then they own it 100%. Now, it's going to be part of their books. There may not be any tariffs or price that have to relate to that particular generator. However, if the mine wants to get power from an IPP, an independent power producer, someone who produces the power, and then thereafter they are the off-taker of that particular power. Now, the issue of prices and tariffs come in. Now, as a regulator, we must regulate those prices and tariffs in the power purchase agreement. We must enable the efficient licensing. In this particular instance, it will be the IPP to recover the full cost of its license activities, including a reasonable margin or return. This is law. Now, just as a thought, is this applicable to own use? The answer is no, as I mentioned, it's not. Because if a company goes there and put up the generator using its own funding, that doesn't apply. However, if there's an agreement in the form of a power purchase agreement, then this particular section of the Act 15.1 applies. There's also 15.1 and D that you must avoid undue discrimination between customer categories. It does apply to IPPs as well, but not so much so, in the context of South Africa, because of the way the supply industry is structured. But we see this becoming more applicable in the future, more so when Eskom is unbundled, and then there's also a restructuring of the municipal or distribution industry. You also have to comply with the principle of the LC pricing policy. There are some points to ponder for the mining sector. As I mentioned, mining companies to build own infrastructure. Own use generation for facilities it's okay. I'm saying this because the mines are not in the business of producing electricity. It's just a question that I'm asking, like to say that now the particular mine has to start concentrating on producing the mineral that they intend to produce. At the same time, they have to start concentrating on producing electricity. But that's the call of that particular mine or company. It's not for us as NESA to worry about. All we worry about is when you bring in an application, we have to deal with it. We're bound by law to look at that particular application. But there's a question that we normally ask. The next question that we ask is building the economic structure not primary responsibility of the government. And I don't want to go back to economics. I'm an engineer, but we have to look at this as well, that, as time goes on, if everybody who's got a mine in the country has to go there and put up his own generator in the mines, what will happen to the country? What will happen to the ESCOMs of this world? What will happen to the municipalities or private distributors that are supplying power to those mines? I mean, it's a question that we're asking. What will happen to the structure and supply industry in South Africa? It's not so much an economics question. It's a question to say, how will the industry, the supply industry, look like in the future? To be honest, we don't have answers. It all depends on how many mining companies are going to invest in putting up their own generation facilities. It depends on those mining sectors who are prepared to buy power from independent power producers. But we can't see the future. We can only see what's happening today. And I must say that, of recent, we just licensed a mine. I think the capacity was about 40 megawatts. But we expect more and more of these particular projects coming to NESA. And we also have a question which I've already touched on. Is the private sector the way to go? Or do we need a combination of both the private sector and government? We don't know. We don't have those answers. We don't even know what's going to happen, when ESCOM is restructured into generation, transmission, and distribution. We don't even know whether transmission will be combined to form the ISMO, will be transmission, and the independent market and system operator. But all these answers, some of them rest with the policymakers, which is the government. The other question that we do ponder and we brainstorm on it is like, the prohibitive cost of capital. For you to get money from financial institutions, like for instance, Nedbank, they need to get their money back. You need to be able to make a profit at the end. And if you can't demonstrate that, it becomes a problem in getting that particular funding. The other one, which is the last one, is probability of creating islands of opulence. Only the rich are going to benefit from this. It's not only the mines. As NESA will go further to all the industries, including the mines. We say, for those consumers who've got deep pockets, they are going to be able to put up this own generation or to get power from an independent power producer. But what about the poor? Anyway, we don't have all the answers now, but we'll see what happens. And then as NESA, as the supply industry evolve, we'll try by all means to make sure that, we're also in line. We'll have to be proactive to make sure that we've got regulation in place to deal with all these questions that are not clearly answered. There's so many balls in the air currently. More points to ponder for the mining sector. There's also another problem. Not all the mines, okay, but some of the mines. Some of the mines, there's a misalignment between the life of the mine projects and the life of the generator. Mining projects generally or typically have a shorter life period. Some of them 5 to 10 years. As I mentioned, I must emphasize not all of them. Power plant projects, even though the Act talks about 15 years, but in most cases they can last 20 to 50 years. So that particular misalignment, as a mining company, you must look at it. You must consider it before you make a decision to buy power from an IP. What I'm trying to say is that, if you've got your own generator and then the mine closes at one point in time, what do you do with that generator? You must think about that. You must try to see what vision do you have for this particular generator. And then that touches on the payback period, because if the mining project is shorter, then somehow you need to have high tariffs for the IPP to make sure that you get all the money. The payback period should be quicker, and then if the payback period is quicker, the tariff is higher. But if it's a bilateral, it's not for us as NESA, because if that particular IPP is going to sell to the mine, the cost is going to be incurred by the mine. It's gonna impact on the price of the commodity. And it's up to the mine to decide to say that, are we able to absorb this particular high tariff? considering that, the mining life is shorter than the project life. So all those decisions, you have to make them, and then it's not our call as NESA. It's for the mining sector to look at it, to look at everything before you make that particular decision. All I'm trying to say is that, I expect, the mining sector to make prudent decisions in this regard. And then that's the reason to say that, is the mining sector ready to invest in the power? And then, to be honest, we've already seen one, the 40 megawatt. That means they're ready. But all we are saying as NESA, please make those prudent and cautious decisions that relate to your circumstances. And then, is renewable energy the only answer to the current problems of load shedding and price hikes? Okay. I know in terms of renewable energy, it reduces the greenhouse emission. You also have to look at the new technology, which is the battery storage, to say that, can you have an IPP that already have battery storage? You also have to look at other renewable energy, because I know the most popular one is solar. To me, I still believe that, it shouldn't be only renewable energy. You should be looking at clean sources to be able to make sure that whatever generation technology that you use, it reduces greenhouse emission in the world, not only in South Africa. NESA, once we issue a license with license condition, and then you have to adhere to the license condition as prescribed in the Act, as stipulated in the license itself. One of the most important aspects is to comply with the grid code. And once a license is issued, we have to monitor and enforce compliance. I'll be quick here. We have already developed regulatory standards. We do undertake, compliance audits. Sometimes those particular compliance audits, we do it in conjunction with other companies like, consultants. In the event that we don't have capacity to do that, we ultimately make sure that each generator conform to the license condition. If you don't, all the compliance enforcement, sections are already stipulated in the Act. I don't want to go there because the topic of today is not so much about that. It's just to make you aware that, once you get a license, you have to comply with the license condition. If there's a complaint, it normally relates to the event where it's an IPP supplying power to the mine. It's possible that the mine can start saying that, this IPP is not providing good quality of supply. And you are more than welcome to come back to NESA to deal with that. There could be other complaints, like for instance, we have had complaints where people, more so in the Port Elizabeth area, saying that, these wind farms, they're making too much noise for us. And some people are saying, hey, they're killing birds. So even if we received any form of complaints, not so much from the IPP or the off-taker, which is the mine in this instance, there could be the public involved. If you have got a biomass plant, for instance, and then it's making a lot of noise, and then that particular generator is next to the community, and the community start complaining, we have to deal with that as NESA. This one, in terms of illegal tariffs, the tariff in the power purchase agreement, it must be complied with. You shouldn't have your own tariff. If you have your own tariff, to us, it's an illegal tariff. If you violate your license condition or grid code, which we normally undertake, the ODs or what we call technical ODs, to check if you're not violating the condition. We investigate, outages that, are not warranted. It does not only apply to ESCOM, it applies to an IPP as well. Even if that particular IPP is selling power to the mining to the mining company, it does apply. We still do the same thing. Disputes. I know in the Act it talks about end user, but it's not only end user, it's customer as well. If it's an IPP and a mine, the mine is a customer of that particular IPP. If there's a dispute between the two parties, as NESA, we have to either mediate or arbitrate. In this instant, we can mediate, and when we mediate, we expect both parties to meet to reach a mutual agreement on their own. All we do is facilitate. Or in this particular instance, we can arbitrate. We can check SNES to see who's on the wrong and come up with a decision at the end. It applies to an IPP and a mining company or related mining companies. So this applies as well. Going to further with dispute resolution, as NESA, we ensure that, the IPP in this instance provides, good service to the mine. If there's a problem, we try to build a relationship between two parties, because sometimes that relationship that's bound through a power purchase agreement, sometimes it can become sour. So we try by all means to make sure that, it's a good relationship or a healthy relationship between the two parties. We also provide customer education to make sure that there's understanding between the parties. However, I must say that dispute resolution is one of the most difficult when it comes to regulation, especially when both parties are angry already for one reason or the other. But that's not today's topic. It's for another topic. I need to conclude, and then in my conclusion, I need to say that in executing its regulatory mandate, the energy regulator endeavors to balance the interest of regulated entities, investors, and customers. The energy regulator acts within the governing legislation and published government policies. We take into account the regulatory principles that you can find it on our website as well, which ensure that whatever that we do, it contributes to the national goals. This next point, I must emphasize it, that, as NESA, we're expected to be technology neutral. We don't promote any type of technology. We don't promote nuclear. We don't promote any renewable energy. We don't promote coal. To us, we're technology neutral. All we deal with is when the application comes to us, we have to look at that particular application. Lastly, we, as NESA, we continue to do or conduct our business in a fair and transparent manner. And then we try by all means to also use, promotion of access to justice, to Promotion of Administration and Justice Act, to make sure that, we involve as much public as we can in making our decision, to make sure that the public gets involved and they're aware of what we are doing.
Thank you, Dennis, for a detailed presentation on the current status of the legislative framework for the mining sector energy generation in South Africa and the role of NERSA. You have also raised some important points to ponder, not only on the impact of the mining generation on the overall generation mix in South Africa, but also on the socio-economic impact of the mining sector energy generation, which we need to take into account. In general, I would like to thank all our presenters for excellent presentations. We have run a bit over time, and thank you for everyone for the number of questions which you have posted. I filtered down the questions, and in terms of the limited time which we have available, I've decided that we're only going to post one question per speaker. So my first question is going to Robert Vatter. And the question is, how are large corporate buyers considering IPP bids? How are they adjudicating the tariffs, especially in light of the potential future Eskom tariff structure changes?
Cool. Thank you very much, Mitch. I hope you can hear me. I think mines, going on the back of the NERSA presentation, I think NERSA probably hasn't received updated information on the tariffs and the savings that are out there from renewable energy. But I think at the moment it's quite clear that relative to the Eskom price increase, even before the April 1 to April 21, is renewable energy, PV, wind, generally are the key technologies we work on. It provides a savings versus Eskom, even with the network charges largely not being recovered. And that's very much because of the time of use generation profile in South Africa. So I think mines obviously are doing that allocation and how the tariffs are calculated. But I think mines are in between how they should procure. Should it be a small project to start as phase 1, or should they procure something that's significant and makes it look like you get to your targets in one easy step. And what we're saying to mines and other clients is, let's do this with a phased approach as part of an energy strategy. The question earlier was around what is the right size project to go out with. Now, we've seen proper or very credible bids for 10 megawatt projects, but then we've had expensive bids for 50 megawatt projects. So scale is important, but I think it's more around the quality of the PPA, the quality of the credit supporting the PPA from the mine, parent guarantees, escrow mechanisms, and those sorts of bits and pieces that were touched on in some of the other presentations as well as mine. But most importantly, in terms of, will the IPP get a credible tariff that will meet the savings? Will the mine be able to get a reasonable offset over time? And is this procurement approach potentially scalable? And therefore, can they move from the 10s to the 50s to achieving large penetrations, with some large corporates having set out quite aggressive targets, 50% penetration by 2030, or in some cases even wanting to go completely renewable energy over time. So I think for us, the private sector is definitely taking this opportunity by the horns, running with it. You know, I'm glad the NERSA, Dennis mentioned that Goldfields, we assume it's the Goldfields presentation, had been approved. So we hope there'll be a number of other generating license applications that will then put into the system. And I think from there, we'll see that there is significant demand, even for mines with shorter lifespans, and the tariffs are very competitive, and it makes a compelling case for both the IPP as well as for the buyer in terms of that point of view. Thank you, Mitch.
Yeah. Thanks, Robert. Thanks for quite a detailed answer to the question. Much appreciated. Then our next question is going to Ashen, and more specifically, the question is, changes in control to the off-taker is a controversial subject in terms of the mining sector. And do you have any views or alternatives on these hard restrictions?
Hi, Mitch. Thanks for that. I think it can be seen it's a contentious issue. It's been discussed or mentioned in a couple of presentations. So ultimately, it's about balancing the off-taker's shareholders' ability to dispose of its asset or dispose of the off-taker, and at the same time, the lenders and the IPP's requirement to always have a credible and creditworthy off-taker. So we've generally seen two things as opposed to a hard approval requirement. Is firstly, there's a permitted list of transferees. That's only appropriate if there have been some sort of discussion or there's likely to be a sale in the near future to an off-taker, so you could, or to a group, so you can put them into a permitted transferee list. But generally what we see is some sort of financial requirements. So provided the new purchaser meets a particular rating or NPV test, then that would be acceptable, together with the lenders and sometimes the IPP's requirements in relation to KYC, sanctions, and PEP. So we've seen it to be pretty much drafted as an independent sort of test, so that all parties on day one need to know what the test is in order to get the change of control approved.
Thanks, Ashen, for your answer. If we can move on, the next question is specifically for Tereshini, and it's a quite relevant question, quite long, but I'll read it through. Which element, tenor, pricing, would suffer the most in a corporate PPA? Even with parent company guarantees and long life of mines, have lenders been comfortable to take on extended tenors with corporate PPAs in line with those seen in the REIPP projects? Or is this still just theoretical, and will the banks remain with more limited tenors than on the typically REIPP projects?
Thanks, Mitch. So looking at this, there are different structures that we can look at to extend the tenor of the life of the loan. One that works well here is a longer amortization profile, as we've seen in REIP. And we can work with that with shorter repayment dates, with the bullet repayment in, let's say, year 10, which is commonly seen in the corporate world. So the project gets the benefit of lower capital repayments on each repayment date. And this assists with the lower tariffs. But I think it must be noted that there must be a refinancing view taken here, and this is taken by both the developer and the lender. Then the commercial banks also work, quite closely with many DFIs to structure longer tenors, done either through co-lending structures, guarantee structures, and we see that working well here as well. Thanks, Mitch.
Thanks, Tereshini. Thanks for the answer. I think it is quite to the point. Then our next question is going to Koen. And there were quite a number of questions on the hydrogen and the entries to barriers. So the question is, what would you say are the main barriers for green hydrogen deployment in South Africa?
Thanks, Mitch, and I'll try to connect to some of the questions I've seen on the chat. So one key barrier is regulation. So we need the government to take a stance around hydrogen norms and standards that can be used for these many new applications. Because today we are deploying them in a test mode, really a proof of concept. But if we want to scale up to industrial projects, we really need to have this regulated. Some of the other barriers, some more than others, are related to the competitiveness gap. If you compare hydrogen directly, let's say, with natural gas to produce hydrogen for the feedstock sector, you still have quite a big difference. Just to quote some numbers, for the gas-based hydrogen, you're between 1.8, 2.5, while with renewable hydrogen today for South Africa, you could be between $3 and $5 a kilogram. So there's still a gap. The good thing for a solution which is around mobility, such as road mobility and the mining trucks, which I referenced, is that this gap is getting smaller thanks to the higher efficiency of the fuel cell versus the diesel engine. What does this mean? This means that actually already by 2025, we can have a scenario where from an overall perspective, green hydrogen will be more competitive than diesel. So the price is not so much as a barrier for this application, but it would be for other applications. The other barrier is storage. There was a question as well. Storage is really a challenge for onboard storage in vehicles. There today we have very high compressed hydrogen gas, up to 700 bars that is being used, but we're also actively looking at other kind of storage solutions or hydrogen carriers such as ammonia or methanol that could be used. Certainly for hydrogen export, this will be a key challenge, and there's many work being done on this topic as well. I think these are the main points. I don't know if there's any specific question on this.
Thanks, Koen. I think that's a quite elaborative question, and obviously you would be able later on for any additional questions which can be posted to you. Our last question goes to Dennis, and it is maybe a bit of a controversial question, but the question is, what are NERSA's long-term plans for easing licensing restrictions on embedded generation projects to allow for larger than 1 megawatt projects to generate without having to obtain a generation license from NERSA? Do we still have Dennis online? Seems we have Dennis. You online?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
no, we can hear you. Yeah, we can hear. Please proceed.
Yeah, sure. In terms of licensing, I'm afraid that the timelines for licensing are legislated already. The 120 days is already in the Electricity Regulation Act. However, I must emphasize the fact that the delay some other time is not coming from our side; it's coming from the applicant. Like for instance, when we're dealing with the Independent Power Producers Program, by the time when they applied, we received all the information, and we're able to do the licensing exercise within a period of six weeks. So if we have received all the information as NERSA, we've done this thing so many times to an extent that we can do it quickly. So if we receive all the information that can be done quickly, that's not a problem for NERSA. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dennis. And then in light of the time, I'm going to hand over to Amit to close our session. Thank you, Amit.
Yeah, thank you, respected presenters, for taking your time to share your thoughts on this important matter. I think we all learned a lot coming from the content and the slides and the questions. There's lots more questions which we could not take, but I think everyone knows the institutions all the members in the panel belong to. Try to reach out to them, and I'm sure they'll be able to help you answer your questions. But on behalf of Nedbank, we would like to thank you all for bearing with us. We're almost 25 minutes past our time limit, and we still have a good audience with us. And I think it bears testimony to the quality and of the content and the nature of the speakers. So thank you very much. On a final parting shot from our side, Nedbank has the skills of one of the most respected mining houses, funding mining houses, and the energy finance teams. And this plays a good marriage to help you find financing solutions for your renewable energy projects in the mining sector. We're happy to engage with you, and we look forward to delivering in this important energy transition in the mining sector in South Africa. It's key that we all make it work. We're happy to see from NERSA there's positive steps to get it done, and it looks like the processes will be much more clear as more applications come through when NERSA will process it. But we think and we still believe this is quite a key tool to help South Africa and our energy supply shortages. The mines are willing to implement such projects, the lenders are willing to fund it, and the country needs it. So with all that important ingredients, I think it's quite important that we push ahead and make this success so that South Africa is a benefactor of all of this clean renewable energy. Thank you again for bearing with us till the end. Have a good afternoon and take care. Be safe.